I want to talk today about ecosystem services and sustainable development, and maybe to concentrate on that linkage a little bit more. I've recently been involved with the country of Bhutan. That's, if you don't know, their national policy is gross national happiness rather than gross national product. And they've been pursuing that for several decades now. Recently, they got a resolution passed through the UN that basically, by unanimous vote, said that, you know, that sort of goal should be the goal of all countries, general well-being and the happiness of their populations. I don't know how well you can see that quote, but this is a quote from the opening address by the Prime Minister of Bhutan. About what really is necessary going forward. We desperately need an economy that serves and nurtures the well-being of all sentient beings on Earth and human happiness that comes from living life in harmony with the natural world, with our communities, with our inner selves. An economy that will serve humanity, not enslave it, etc. So I think this is a radical departure from the conventional view of what the goal of the economy is. And I think it's something that we really need to take seriously going forward if we really hope to create a sustainable and desirable future. So this is a complex problem, of course, and like all complex problems, it requires the integration of these three elements of having an adequate vision, not only of how the world is, our scientific paradigms, our understanding of the world. And our scientific paradigms, I think, are changing quite rapidly as we learn more about how complex systems function, we learn more about human psychology, etc. But also how we would like the world to be. So our visions of the future, our goals. And I think that also is changing quite rapidly. As the former slide showed, there's a broader recognition that what we're really after is sustainable human well-being, and that economic growth in the conventional sense is a means to that end, but as I'll show, it has some other implications that may be undesirable. Our tools and analytical techniques, our implementation strategies and instruments and policies then need to be integrated with that changing vision in order to actually solve these complex problems. So our scientific understanding of the past and how we got here, I think, is also advancing quite rapidly. As we begin to develop a more integrated picture, a more integrated history and future of people on Earth, or I hope, this is a project I've been involved with for a while now. This sort of complex diagram is just one attempt to put together some of the environmental and human history on one graph. It's on a log scale going back to 100,000 years ago up to the present. Showing some of the natural system variables. The red line is the temperature record over that period. And these lines are basically the development of human civilization, gross world product, human population, CO2. Over here is the technological changes. And over here are some of the civilizations that have come and gone. One dramatic feature of this diagram is just how the temperature has changed over that period. Starting in the Pleistocene, the temperature was quite erratic and going through ice ages and interglacial periods. It wasn't until the start of the Holocene that temperature really stabilized and allowed civilization as we know it to evolve. And that temperature record is now drifting off of that long-term stable pattern, as we all know. And the implications of that for our future, I think, are the things that we're interested in. So what can we learn from an analysis of how civilizations have survived or not during this historical period? What has led to the growth, sustainability, and collapse of civilizations like the Roman Empire or the Maya and others. So developing that science of the past in order to create a better future. It's not a way of predicting the future. It's really a way of creating the future. So another aspect of the changing science is the understanding of the world as a complex system. And we know that it's a nonlinear adaptive system with thresholds and tipping points and surprises. This is not something that changes gradually. So this is from a paper by Tim Lenton that just shows some of the potential tipping elements in the climate system. And of course, the most well-known of those is the melting of the ice sheets. But there are several others that are could potentially cause quite rapid shifts in our climate system. We also know that there are fundamental resource constraints. For example, peak oil. And we know that, for example, peak oil will probably even be less positive than this diagram shows. Got some water. Sorry. Because the net energy from extraction of oil and gas, there you go, thank you. Should have done this before I started. The net energy is going to go down even faster than the gross energy as it becomes harder to find and extract and deliver fossil fuel resources. Thanks. So, and of course, we know that there are also fundamental boundaries and limits, planetary boundaries as they're called, and ecological constraints. This is from a recent paper that I was involved with where we tried to identify what those planetary boundaries were. What's the safe operating space for humanity within the biosphere? And we identified these 9 variables, all of which could potentially cause tipping elements in the growth of civilization. Certainly climate change is the best studied of those, biodiversity loss, the nitrogen cycle. All 3 of these we estimated were probably outside the safe operating space. And several others are rapidly approaching that safe boundary. So the recognition that there are planetary boundaries, I think, is something that our science is developing. Now, these inconvenient truths are not the movie that most people are lining up to go see. And part of that is the psychology of this all. People don't want to be told the inconvenient truths. They'd rather be told a reassuring lie. But in fact, I think what we need is a third movie. A third movie that actually emphasizes that a sustainable and desirable economy and society and nature is really possible, viable, and something that we're capable of creating. It's not all the bad news, but it's also how do we create a positive future. So that's partly what I'm going to try and talk about today. What does that alternative future look like? This is a report that we recently did for the UN as part of the Rio Plus 20 preparations that tried to lay out from an ecological economics perspective what that sustainable and desirable economy and society and nature might look like. And I have one hard copy of this. I'll pass it around as long as I get it back at the end. And first of all, recognizing that it is a change in vision to recognize that the economy is embedded within society, which is embedded within nature. That it's not a separate thing. It's something that's totally enclosed. Now, this is very different from the sort of empty world vision of the economy, which looks something like this. We had land, labor, and capital, the primary factors of production. And you can see that land is kind of grayed out because there's the assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. If you run out of land or natural resources, you can always substitute more labor or capital and produce goods and services measured by GDP, which are then either consumed or reinvested to make more capital so you can produce and consume more in the future. And that individual welfare is largely a function of how much the absolute amount that we consume. So the more the better. There's no fundamental limits on this production process. The economy can grow forever. Poverty is best solved by more economic growth because it's always better to have more than to have less. You don't have to worry about how it's distributed, et cetera. And property rights are best held in the private sphere because these are largely marketed, private, rival, and excludable goods and services that we're talking about over here. So that vision may have been adequate in the past when the world was relatively empty, but we live in a very different world. We live now in a full world where we are approaching those planetary boundaries, if not exceeding them. And we have to recognize the reality of this sort of changing vision, that we're in a materially closed Earth system. The economy cannot grow in physical size indefinitely within a materially closed Earth. That these four basic types of assets or capital are all required in some sort of balanced way to produce any sort of human benefits, including conventional economic goods and services, but also directly contributing to human well-being in the form of ecosystem services and other things. So there's not unlimited substitutability. These things are all required in some more balanced way. That human well-being is a much more complex function than simply the more we consume, the better off we are. In fact, it's more relative consumption than absolute consumption that affects people's well-being. And there's a whole range of non-consumption oriented inputs that affect human well-being. I mean, this is somewhat obvious, I think, when you stop to think about it. But there's a whole emerging field of, it's called the science of happiness, or positive psychology, where people are trying to understand what actually does lead to human well-being, and also the sustainability of that. And I think that's where the natural capital part comes in. How does natural capital contribute to human well-being, both through the conventional economic production process, but also directly? So it's changing the vision to recognize that is the ultimate end that we're pursuing, this idea of sustainable human well-being. It requires then that we understand what do we mean by well-being and what do we mean by sustainability, and how do the intermediate means and ends contribute to that final end, and not get so focused on those intermediate means and ends, like GDP, that we lose sight of what the ultimate goal is. So one part of that is how do we better understand human well-being, quality of life, etc. This is a diagram that tries to put some of the pieces of that puzzle together. There's this idea of subjective well-being, and there have been a lot of people out there surveying populations around the world, asking them, how satisfied are you with your life? And there's a lot of interesting research coming out of that, both over time, within populations, and between countries. And the recognition that that's dependent on this sort of larger set of basic human needs that include things like subsistence and reproduction, but also a whole range of other factors that affect people's basic sense of well-being. How people weight those different needs and how they're being fulfilled varies by individual personalities and cultures, etc. But these are all necessary in some way to have a sense of subjective well-being. What we can do is provide the opportunities for people to meet those needs and feel this sense of subjective well-being by how we arrange our assets, our built, our human, our social, our natural capital, and how we use our time. So this is some of the survey data that I mentioned on mean life satisfaction over here versus GDP per capita on this axis. And you can see that there's quite a steep curve at first, but after about $10,000 or so dollars per capita. Thank you. That relationship sort of disappears. That there's a relatively flat relationship here. That the USA and Norway and the Emirates, which are in the order of 35, 40,000 almost GDP dollars per capita per year, they're not really any happier than people in Venezuela or Costa Rica, which have a quarter of the GDP per capita. So. How do ecosystem services contribute to human well-being? If you don't know, they are the benefits that humans derive from functioning ecosystems. And this is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. You may have seen that they've sort of categorized these services into these four basic categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services, all contributing in various ways to these various aspects of human well-being that I'm talking about. One thing that's kind of missing from this diagram is that these services don't occur really without the contribution of the other three types of capital. It's not that they flow directly into human well-being, but they're required in a more interactive way, as I'll show in a second. This idea of ecosystem services has really taken off in recent years. This is from the ISI Web of Knowledge, just showing the number of papers that have been published on the topic of ecosystem services over the last several decades. And you can see there's rapid exponential growth in the academic interest in this idea of ecosystem services. And just to reiterate some basic facts about ecosystem services and natural capital, as I said, they're the contributions of ecosystem structure and function, but in combination with other inputs to human well-being. So it makes it an inherently transdisciplinary field of study. You can't understand ecosystem services without understanding the ecosystems, but also the human part of the system, the beneficiaries of these services, and how all four of those types of capital interact to produce those benefits. They are a significant contribution to human well-being, and I'll show an estimate that we did of how significant that contribution is. But I think as we learn more about those services and those interconnections, the level of significance is just increasing. We know that they're being threatened by many activities, including some of these things that were affecting our planetary boundaries, climate change, biodiversity loss, and other of those issues. And we know that this is a different way of looking at the relationship between nature and humans, that it's a way of understanding and quantifying the trade-offs and synergies that are always there. So some argue that we shouldn't value ecosystem services, but in fact, we are valuing them every time we make a decision about the environment. But we're just doing it more implicitly than explicitly. And so I think we need to move to a more explicit understanding of those trade-offs, and this is a way to do that. And it also has some implications in terms of property rights and institutions and how we manage those resources, because they're in many ways inherently common pool or public goods, so they're not well managed by conventional market institutions as some other types of resources are. So it's another way of showing this, that these four types of assets, our natural, human, social, and built capital, are all required in some sort of interaction in order to produce human well-being. Natural capital doesn't flow directly into human well-being. And that's what ecosystem services are, is the relative contribution here of natural capital. In an empty world, we had lots of natural capital, not so much of the other three. So it made sense to not worry so much about the ecosystem services. We could sort of get away with ignoring them to some extent, although there have been many examples of civilizations that have collapsed because of ignoring those services when they did get to a full status, at least regionally. We're now in a full status, more or less globally, where our natural capital assets are really becoming the limiting factor in many cases of at least sustaining our well-being. And what we need to do, I think, is envision a better world where those types of assets are in better balance, where we can actually improve human well-being. It may require actually reducing some of the built and other forms of capital. So this concept of ecosystem services has gotten very popular, but I think there have been some mistaken identities about them that I'll just try to mention. First of all, that people confuse economics with the market, and I don't think that's a valid comparison. The market is one institution that we use to allocate resources and can be quite effective in certain circumstances, but it's certainly not the only institution, and economics should be really about providing sustainable human well-being. So it's much broader than just the market. And I think to have a real economics and ecological economics, you have to look at the whole system and everything that contributes to human well-being. That valuation of ecosystem services or natural capital is not the same as advocating privatization or commodification or trading of those services. As I said, they're largely public goods, and that doesn't mean that we don't value them. We do value them in all of our decisions, I said implicitly, and we need to make that more explicit. expressing those values in monetary units is not the same as deriving them from market or exchange values either. So we know that they affect our well-being. That's really, and their relative contribution is a measure of their value, but much of that is outside the market. You're never going to get market values to approximate it, so that you shouldn't make that distinction. And then one way of thinking about that and the property rights issues, again, is this distinction between rival and non-rival goods, things that are, as one person's benefiting from a good prevents other people from benefiting. So things like, tomatoes. If I eat the tomato, you can't eat the same tomato. But many ecosystem services are non-rival, that, if I benefit from climate, a good climate, you also benefit. It doesn't affect me benefiting as well. Some goods and services are easy to exclude or excludable. You can prevent people from benefiting unless they compensate you in some way. But many are non-excludable or very difficult, if not impossible, to exclude, like climate. So markets work well for rival and excludable goods. They don't work so well for the other three categories, and we need to think about different kinds of institutions that can better handle those kinds of resources. And also it gives us a way of acknowledging what is the right balance between the private market and other kinds of institutions in order to achieve our goal. There's also a range of possible uses for ecosystem services and their valuation, ranging from simply raising awareness to changing our national income accounts, and there's lots of activity in this area, as I'll show in a second, to acknowledge the value of our natural capital assets and our other assets, to analyzing specific policies, what are the implications of specific policies on ecosystem services and ultimately our well-being. Urban and regional planning has those kinds of implications. Any sort of scenario for changes in land use has implications for the whole range of different contributions to well-being. We need to acknowledge natural capital components. This idea of payment for ecosystem services, which has become quite a popular way to compensate private landowners, anyway, for the provision of these services, certainly requires that we understand what the value of those services are. There's this idea of full cost accounting for businesses. Business activities have implications for ecosystem services, both directly in their operations, but all the way down through their supply chain. And there's a company called True Cost that I've been involved with that tries to estimate those external environmental costs by company and by product. And that's becoming a quite interesting activity. The company at Puma has recently created a fairly elaborate environmental profit and loss statement so they can understand what those implications are. And finally, this idea of alternative institutions, the thinking of ecosystems as an asset that we hold in trust for the larger community rather than something to be exploited by private individuals. The state of Vermont has recently advocated or has a bill pending in the legislature to create a Vermont Common Asset Trust that would sort of do the same sort of thing. I'm not sure what the status of that bill is. They passed it? Really? Okay, good. I'll have to add that to the talk. So how important are these assets? Several years ago, we tried to estimate the total contribution of ecosystem services to our well-being, and we came up with this estimate of something in the order of $16 to $54 trillion per year, with an average of about 33 trillion, so significantly larger than global GDP at the time. And we certainly acknowledged in this paper that this was just a rough estimate, probably, or almost certainly an underestimate of the contribution, but still, significantly bigger than what people thought of as the economy at the time. We didn't control what they put on the cover of the magazine, and they said pricing rather than valuing, and I think that's led to some confusion as well, because we're not advocating pricing for exchange, which is the implication there, but valuing these resources as assets that contribute to well-being without ever being exchanged in markets. So this is sort of a summary of those initial estimates. And we added up those 17 different ecosystem services over these 16 different biomes, came up with an average value per hectare, and then multiplied that by the area to come up with our total values. More recently, there's a new journal that's just started called Ecosystem Services. This is another indication of the academic interest in the area. So I'll pass this one around as well. This is the first issue. And as part of the TEEB study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, you may have heard of that one, they created a database that updated some of these values, and these are the more recent estimates of the unit values by ecosystem or by biome of these different ecosystem services expressed in monetary units. And you can see that if you take a little bit of time, that almost all of those values have increased from their initial estimates, and this is to be expected because we have significantly more studies of these services than we had before, and that was one of our presumptions in the original paper, that that lack of study of some of these services and some of these ecosystems would only increase their values, as would solving many of the other problems that we identified in the original paper. So this original study, I think, has had its intended goal, has reached its intended goal of really stimulating interest and research on this topic. Another way of looking at this, in terms of the value of ecosystem services, more from an input-output or national accounting kind of framework, is to think of all of the sectors of the economy and all their interactions between each other. And what ecosystems are providing are inputs to all of those sectors of one kind or another. So they have direct inputs in terms of water and materials and climate, et cetera. That implies that indirectly they are providing a whole range of services to households. So the part of the value of everything that we buy on the market is due to the input from ecosystems and their services. So we can estimate that indirect value of the marketed services, but then they also, as I said, provide direct benefits to households that we can also estimate, and they provide some negative impacts on ecosystems, some costs that we can also estimate. I'll give you a quick example of how one estimates one of the values of one of these services. And this was the value of coastal wetlands for storm protection. And this is Hurricane Katrina approaching the coast of Louisiana. What one needs to do this kind of analysis is a history of all of the storms that have hit the coast. And we did the study for the coast of the U.S. because that's where we could get enough data, but we're hoping to expand this to the Australian and Chinese coasts in the near future. So we have that data, then you could look at the swath of each storm and say, well, how much damage did this storm cost? What were the coastal wetlands in the swath of the storm? What's the infrastructure in the swath that's there to be damaged? We estimated from nighttime satellite imagery. And what's the magnitude of the storm? You could put all of that information together in a little regression equation and try to estimate the relative damages from the wind speed and the wetland area in this case. And then that would tell you the avoided cost. So how much would the damages change if you increased the area of wetlands by a hectare, for example? That explains about 60% of the variation in the relative damages for the data set that we had. And that allows us then to map the marginal and the total value of these coastal wetlands for storm protection. You can see that there's quite a large range of values. And the high values occur where you have those three variables interacting, where you have a lot of storms to be protected from, you have a lot of infrastructure to be protected, and you have a lot of wetlands to do the protection. So from that, then you could say, what a loss of a single hectare led to, in terms of damages, and we can estimate when you throw in the annual probability of hurricanes, you can get a range of values per square kilometer that's quite large, and the means and medians are also quite large, and you can add that all up and get an estimate of the total contribution of 23 or so billion per year just for the storm protection services. So the point is that wetlands provide not only storm protection, but a whole range of other services. And this sort of analysis, I think, has had some significant impact on decisions by, for example, the Corps of Engineers. And so after Katrina, their first reaction was, well, let's build a bigger levee, and let's build a levee along the whole coast of Louisiana. And then we started looking at how much that would cost and how much it would cost to maintain. And the alternative is to use our natural capital assets to do the storm protection, and also to provide all of these other services like recreation and fisheries, et cetera. So it's I think led to a change in their philosophy and much more interest in using freshwater diversions of the Mississippi River to reestablish some of the coastal wetlands in order to provide that service. Ultimately, I think we can do a much more sophisticated job of analyzing ecosystem services, and we have, I think, some of the computer tools and data available now to allow us to build simulation models of entire landscapes and how the natural systems and the human systems are interconnected, and what sorts of changes would occur under different land use and policy and other scenarios. So I think this is an active area of research going forward, and I think is the way that we will better come to grips with and understand ecosystem services. And I think the missing element in all of this is the ability to have a relatively easy to apply tool that will give us at least a starting point for what these services look like on a particular area of land. So one project we've been working on is something called MIMES, Multi-Scale Integrated Models of Ecosystem Services, where we try to combine for every particular pixel or cell in the landscape, a model of the whole system, including the natural capital components and the human capital components. So there's the economy as well as the social and human capital, and how those are linked together by the contribution of ecosystem services and over a whole range of areas. So the vision here is a tool that would allow you to go online, identify an area of the planet, and produce a running model that would give you at least a default run of what the ecosystem services are, how they might change with different policies. So this is still in the development stage, but it's sort of a proof of concept, and we're able to apply this sort of modeling at multiple scales, everywhere from the global scale down to individual watersheds. As I said, this idea of ecosystem services is really catching on at other levels, and this is something that's just started, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this is a IPCC-like body that will be devoted to this issue of ecosystem services, and will come out with, I assume, regular assessments of the global status and trends in ecosystem services. The World Bank has recently gotten fairly interested in this. This is a quote from their former president on why this sort of accounting for natural capital is important. You are what you measure, he says, and we need to assess our natural wealth. We shouldn't assume that wealth to be zero. Their program is called WAVES, Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services. You can check that out on the web. So they're engaging a whole range of countries in terms of adding natural capital accounting to their national income accounts. More recently, I've been involved in setting up something called the Ecosystem Services Partnership, and this is an effort to have a place where everyone working on this issue can go and share information, and so it's open to both academics and practitioners of various kinds, and this is the website for that. We had a conference recently in Portland, and the next international conference will be in Bali, Indonesia, so we're hoping that many of you will come to that one. It's a little bit closer. But it allows one to have sort of a one-stop shopping experience to find out what's going on with ecosystem services and share information with others. what we're trying to do is move away from this sort of thing, which all too often happens in our lives, to this sort of thing. How do we get everyone sort of pulling in the same direction and talking more with each other and cooperating rather than expending a lot of effort unnecessarily? So that's the ecosystem services part, the natural capital component, but I wanted to spend some time as well talking about the other contributors to human well-being. This is from a book by Wilkinson and Pickett recently called The Spirit Level on the relationship between the distribution of wealth, income inequality, and this whole range of social problems, from everything from life expectancy to imprisonment rates to trust and obesity. And you can see that there's quite a strong relationship here in the OECD countries anyway, with the more unequal the income distribution, the higher the rates of all of these social problems. The U.S. is way up here, and Australia is somewhere in the middle there. This affects social capital quite directly. It's interesting, too, that this is a survey that was done in the U.S., where this is the actual distribution of wealth in the U.S., quite skewed to the top few percentages. But they asked people what they thought the income distribution was, and they got this middle curve. So they thought it was much more evenly distributed than it really is. But then they asked them also how would they like it to be, and they came up with this third distribution. And interestingly enough, this was consistent across people from all political persuasions and genders, and that really didn't influence it. They all sort of had the same opinion. And so even people that were politically very, very far to the right said that they would like this distribution to occur, which is really closer to the distribution of income in Sweden, not in the United States. Unfortunately, we're not going down that road, and we are focusing much more in most countries on increasing GDP, our consumption and production measured by GDP. And it's well known that GDP, gross domestic product, was never designed as a measure of economic welfare. It doesn't account for the distribution of income at all. If all of the GDP could be going to a single person, and it wouldn't be any different than if it were equally distributed. So there have been several efforts recently to propose alternatives to GDP that are better approximations, anyway, of welfare, well-being, et cetera. And this is one interesting one called the Genuine Progress Indicator. It's interesting because it's been applied and it's being used by several different states and countries these days. And it looks like this. It has these corrections, if you will. It starts with personal consumption expenditures, which are a major component of GDP, but then it weights them by income distribution to account for this effect of distribution. It adds a few things that are left out, like household labor and volunteer work. Obviously good things, but are not marketed and left out of GDP. And then it subtracts a bunch of things that are in there that shouldn't be, like the cost of crime, the cost of family breakdown, underemployment, loss of leisure time, elements that reflect the human, social, and natural capital components. All the green things are natural capital adjustments, cost of air and water pollution, et cetera. What's interesting is the results that you get when you apply that alternative measure. This is for the U.S. GDP has been going up, since the 1950s or so until recently. GPI has followed that quite closely until about 1975, after which it's leveled off and really hasn't been improving at all. So, we're in the period of what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth. The economy's growing, but it's not economic because it's not really improving real welfare if you make some of the appropriate adjustments. More recently, the state of Maryland has adopted the Genuine Progress Indicator as one of their official state statistics. I think this is the first official government body that's done that. You can check out their website. I think it's quite well done and interesting, and explains all the different components and how they're varying, and also what they're doing about it. So this is from a recent press release where the governors, of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, is saying it's one of the best ways to evaluate progress, and provides a comprehensive look at both the natural resources and the community, and they're able to see where they need to focus their effort, and gives a better guide to policy decisions going forward. We recently estimated the GPI for the state of Oregon as well, just to show that there are some significant regional differences from state to state compared to the national average, and some of the underlying reasons for that. So the policies, at the state level and other levels do affect both GDP and GPI. And what you're really trying to improve, I think, going forward is this, a measure of genuine progress rather than just GDP. This is the United States, again, looking at a range of some of the other indicators that are out there. So the blue line is GDP per capita. GPI per capita is the red line. Again, and these are all indexed, so you can sort of show the changes over time. The ecological footprint, which you may know about for the U.S., which per capita hasn't been changing that much over this time period. But the biocapacity, our natural capital assets, at least in physical terms, has been going down. And life satisfaction, this line, hasn't really changed much at all. It's gone down slightly over that period. So all this increase in GDP hasn't really improved life satisfaction. But the Human Development Index has been changing quite gradually. Compare that with countries like Sweden, where there was a very tight correlation for a while. They've also started to diverge from that in terms of GDP. But maybe more interestingly is it's what's happening in China, where GDP, the blue line, had just been going through the roof recently. And GPI was following that for a while, till about maybe the late 90s, after which all of those increasing costs, the distribution of wealth was getting much worse. Their Gini coefficient is the orange line here. So the distribution's been getting worse, and the environmental costs are well known. If you've been to Beijing or Shanghai recently, the air and water pollution are quite evident. So they're not really making significant progress. Recently, we've tried to assemble the data for all of the countries for which the GPI has been estimated. We found data for 17 countries. Plotted out here, you can see that Australia is kind of an interesting case, where the GPI per capita has been quite high for a while, and actually has been improving in recent decades. And some other countries like Poland down here, and China, and India and Vietnam. What we were able to do is, from this, create an estimate, anyway, of what the global GPI might look like from a recent paper that's in review. And you can see that, like the U.S., this shows that our genuine progress at the global scale is probably flattened out, if not headed down. There's quite a strong correlation in this period from the 1950 or so up until roughly 1975. But after that, there's a strong negative correlation. So we're not really making progress at the global scale. All of this emphasis on GDP is crossing planetary boundaries, but it's not really improving our sustainable well-being. So it's not sustainable or desirable. What we really need to do is to focus a bit on those elements of well-being within and stay within the planetary boundaries, what's been called the donut that gives us all of the things that we need for a high quality of life, but doesn't cross the boundaries. How do we get there? The dimensions of this well-being focused economy include a sustainable scale, making sure that we respect the planetary boundaries and the ecological limits, a fair distribution of resources and capabilities for flourishing, and a more efficient allocation that takes into account all of the assets that we have at our disposal. There are a whole range of policy reforms that I think we can envision within that. I think the most important one is just changing the vision of our goal. But once we've gotten that changed, I think we can start thinking about reversing the emphasis on consumerism, that's not really the path to a sustainable well-being. Expanding the common sector of the economy, as it's called. How do we expand our emphasis on public goods, on natural and social capital assets, and treat them as assets that we are holding in trust, in common for everyone. Systematic caps on natural resources, including greenhouse gases. And something more about sharing work time. How do we allocate employment, recognizing that work is more than just a way to earn money to buy stuff, but it's really something that contributes directly to people's well-being, and the psychology of that is very clear. So how do we make sure that we create employment that really is more fulfilling as well as paying the bills? Question comes up immediately. How can you have an economy that's not growing? Won't it just collapse? And this was the question that Peter Victor asked in his book, Managing Without Growth, and he built a model of the Canadian economy that said, well, could you have a no-growth positive economy? And he was able to show that, in fact, you could have a no-growth disaster. If all you did was stop growth, then you would have unemployment and poverty increasing, et cetera, all of the things that are predicted to happen. But if you implement the right set of policies, you could have a no-growth positive economy with reduced poverty, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, higher quality of life, which is what we're looking for. So there's some sort of a feasibility test. Peter listed in his book 12 things that we would need to change, the policies that we would need to change to get from A to B. And that included many of the things I've already talked about, new meanings and measures of success. We'd have to change from measuring success by increasing GDP to measuring success from some better indicator of sustainable well-being. GPI is certainly not the perfect one, but I think we need to think about what we do need to measure. Limits on materials, energy, waste, and land use, recognizing the planetary boundaries and the fundamental resource constraints. More meaningful prices, incorporating or internalizing all of those external costs that we've been talking about in order to get the market to tell the truth about the cost of things. More durable, repairable products. So we want things that last, that contribute to well-being and not necessarily just to creating and consuming more. Fewer status goods, so stop consuming things simply for status, but consume the things that we really need, and we can confer status in other ways that are not so consumptive. More informative advertising that tells us about what goods and services can do rather than trying to change people's values toward higher levels of consumption. Better screening of technology, so how do we recognize that technology is a good servant but a poor master and get it to operate more towards the social benefit. More efficient capital stock in the same way of more efficient consumer goods. How do we build capital stock, like particularly the built infrastructure of houses and buildings that reduce their energy consumption? More local, less global. How do we spend the appropriate, trade in the appropriate things and produce locally things that are possible to produce locally, particularly food and other bulk commodities. Certainly reduced inequality, as we've already talked about, because this has many positive side effects in terms of building social capital and contributing to well-being. Less work, more leisure. Anybody opposed to this one? This is the easiest one to get at least general agreement on, but how do you actually do that? Get people to think about work as something that contributes to their life satisfaction and their well-being, and not necessarily just chasing higher income. And finally, education for life and not just work. And this is certainly the appropriate audience to talk about this with. How do we think about education as not just to get a job, but education to actually help us to create a positive life for ourselves and for our communities, both now and in the future. Of course, there's always skeptics out there. What if this is all a big hoax and we just create this better world for nothing? I think our challenge is really how to create the better world and to focus much more on that. And getting back to the third movie, how do we create that vision of a sustainable and desirable future that focuses on quality of life? Part of that, I think, is going to be breaking our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, fossil fuels and overconsumption. And it is a type of addiction. We are so locked in to many of the patterns in the conventional system that it's not surprising that it's going to be difficult to change those patterns. And it's going to take a major regime shift. And I don't think it will be easy. But it is going to take, I think, a lot of discussion and talk. And one of the things that we're doing is trying to create a venue for having that kind of discussion of what the real solutions might be to these problems. And this is a new journal that we've created called Solutions, and it's kind of I have a few hard copies here that I'll pass around as long as I get them back. As a venue for having that broader discussion of what kind of world we really want, and what does that entail. So this is a hybrid academic and popular magazine, so it's peer-reviewed, but it's also available on newsstands. Our rule of thumb is no more than a third of the articles can be about discussing the problem, and 2/3 has to be about discussing the solutions. And it's reviewed in a more constructive way, so it's got a lot of unique features. And so I'm hoping that you'll take a look. It's all available for free online. Take a look at this website, and hopefully you'll read about some of the solutions others are proposing and contribute some of your own, and you'll be in good company when you read Solutions. So thanks very much.